Hey everyone, I'm back with another Shogi openings video. We were in the middle of learning Bishop 4e strategy, and I was supposed to make video 3 for that. But the problem with Bishop 4e strategy is that it has too many difficult variations, and it's hard for me to study and follow those fast enough. And besides, you might get bored. So for a change, today I'm going to be talking about pawn 3h strategy, another white's optional variation against black's side pawn picker opening. So I'd like to start from this basic position of side pawn picker. Why don't we quickly go over the moves before this position? So they open bishop's diagonal, and then push rook pawns, and golds develop, and pawn exchange. White does that too, and then black takes a side pawn on 3d. Alright, now in pawn 3h strategy, just as in double side pawn picker and bishop 4e strategy, white makes a bishop trade. Black recaptures, and then so far we've seen double side pawn picker, this move, and bishop 4e strategy, this move. But today, pawn to 3h strategy starts with this pawn drop to 3h. Yeah, this move is what it's named after. So the question is, which piece should you take it with? So let's say gold takes 3h first. Well then, what will suddenly turn to bishop 4e strategy and drops the bishop to 4e. Well, the reason is, if black tries to go in the same standard move lines as in bishop 4e strategy, rook to 2d, white doesn't drop his pawn to c. He just goes ahead taking this pawn. So, if gold takes it, rook promotes here, and the difference from bishop 4e strategy here is that the black's king is in a threat mate. You see, it's a simple threat mate, starting from silver on the head, and discover check. So, that means black has to do something about it, and after black deals with it, white can then block the rook by dropping a pawn. It's a win for white. So actually, after that bishop drop on 4e, the best option for black is to drop his bishop to 7g at this position. And we've seen this bishop drop in the primary line of bishop 4e strategy, right? But it was after the rook moved to 2d. But since that rook move doesn't work for this time, you have to drop the bishop now. So the following moves go similar to bishop 4e strategy, like rook abandons itself, and then he takes a rook, and bishop promotion. The only difference is that the rook is taken out here on 2d by the pawn, or just like now, is taken by the bishop on 3d. And well, in fact, in bishop 4e strategy 2, there's a minor variation in which black drops his bishop to 7g before he moves the rook to 2d. Just like that. And I haven't covered that one in my bishop 4e strategy videos yet, so maybe I should have done that in advance. But basically, in this position, always this wall structure is awful. So no matter what kind of variation we go into after this position, that will be worse for black than the corresponding variation in bishop 4e strategy. You see, always the king cannot run to this side. It's blocked. So definitely taking the 3h pawn with the gold is not good for black. So gold to 3h is not the correct move. So actually the correct line, the primary line here, is silver takes 3h. But before we go into the main line, we also have to see what happens after silver moves to 2h. Well, in this case, again, white then turns to bishop 4e strategy with this drop. Now, if you look at this position carefully, you see that the only difference now from bishop 4e strategy is that the pawn remains here as opposed to taken on black's piece stand. You see, by this silver move, right? So let's see what kind of difference does it make. So if we go along the same Shogi line of bishop 4e strategy, rook moves, pawn drop, and bishop drop, rook abandons, he takes the rook, and bishop promotes. And in this position, the Shogi move is knight 3c. However, because this pawn on 3h, now white can try this rook drop here. So bishop and rook are attacking that 2g square. So black can only protect the silver by the gold. But here comes a powerful silver drop, and it's all over for black. So that pawn on 3h is really important here. If it was bishop 4e strategy, you see the pawn supposed to be here. So this rook drop here is not going to work. By gold to 3i. Now that the knight is defended, simply promoting the bishop is not very good. So he'll have to drop a silver, but just take it and a silver fork, and it's fine. So silver to 2h will be met by another variation of bishop 4e strategy. Okay, and alternatively, he can drop a pawn here too. This is also interesting. Black has to take it, and then bishop 4e. If black tries to go with the similar line, here white then goes ahead, takes the pawn again. And black may take it, and rook promotes, and black can only take the knight now, of course, but look at this pawn promotion sacrifice. If black takes it, checkmate. Beautiful. So after this pawn promotion sack, well, black can try this dragon sack. If gold takes it, bishop drop, forking the king and the dragon. But white can calmly drop the silver here, thus attacking back at the dragon, also making a threat mate. So it's a win for white. So maybe black can only move the gold here, but dragon check, pawn block, silver, gold moves backward, but maybe knight drop. And let's take the knight now, threatening another knight drop here. And it's obviously good for white, okay? Oh, and also, other than this bishop drop, he can also drop it to here at this position. Well, then silver takes this pawn, promotes. Okay, this pawn drop is pretty strong, but how about lance drop? Maybe bishop fork. Another difficult game, but white seems to be a little bit better. Well, also gold can move forward here, but let's calmly go back. But this pawn drop comes up. Has to go back. And bishop drop. I don't know, still a cool game. So anyway, leaving the pawn there on 3h and moving the silver to 2h here is not very good for black. So finally we go into the main line, and that's silver takes 3h. Now this time white shouldn't go for bishop 4e drop. Now this bishop structure on black's camp is now excellent. It's forming a strong connection like a Mino castle, and moreover the king can go in there anytime when it's attacked from the left side. Okay, so this is where the main line of pawn to 3h strategy starts. And you might have a question here, what if white drops a pawn to here on 2h? The knight is dead. But it's okay for black because the rook can simply go back to 2d, forking the pawn and the knight. Even if the pawn promotes, the rook can go ahead, and it's good for black. And moreover, black can also simply make a pawn drop here, which white can take it. And you see, black's attack is obviously stronger. So, pawn drop to 2h is no problem for black. Okay, so here comes the key move of this strategy. It's this. Bishop drop to 4d. A very interesting bishop drop. It seems it's only attacking the silver, and it's not a big deal, but actually, this bishop drop is beautiful. You're going to see why. And if you were to drop a bishop, maybe alternatively, you can come up with this bishop drop, because it seems more reasonable, since now it's attacking the silver again. And moreover, now it's stopping the rook from going back to 2d, which allows him to drop a pawn to 2h in the next move, right? But actually, black is fine. Black can just drop a pawn blocking the rook and attacking the rook at the same time. Rook runs attacking the gold, but silver attacks again. Rook runs here, but another pawn drop attacking the rook. And if rook goes back, black can now simply deal with that pawn drop by gold move to 3i, and black's fine. Even if white tries to make a rook trade here, black can just accept it, and another rook fork Bishop promotes, but knight falls. And if this pawn drop, this bishop drop will be much stronger. So that's the consequence of bishop 3c drop. So now let's go and see what happens after bishop to 4d. And the main line here is, of course, pawn drop to hg. And alternatively, there are two other options. That's knight to 7g and also bishop drop to 7g, which are both pretty dangerous moves, but very, very interesting and difficult and exciting variations. But we're not going to go into that in this video. I'm going to cover those in the future. So let's see the main line, pawn drop to hg. Okay, so the rook runs to 7f, attacking the gold. Now here comes the main reason of that bishop drop. If black blocks it with the silver attacking the rook, now black is in a trouble. Because look at this. White moves the rook back to 7d, and look at this position really carefully, and you'll see white is now threatening to make this interesting tactic in the next move, which is silver promotes to 7g, take the silver, checking and making a discovered attack on the rook. So black loses his rook, right? So that's the main threat at this position. And remember, black always have to care this pawn drop as well. So the simplest way of removing that bishop sacrifice threat, black can move the rook out of that rank, the d rank, but the only available square is here on 3f. But now look at this, the bishop on 4d covers this 2f square, that's stopping the rook from coming back to second file. So here, of course, he drops the pawn to 2h, and black is in trouble. So rook to 3f is not good. So other option is to save the king from being checked by the bishop. So let's say king to 4h now, because that's the best square to go to. But white still can try that bishop sack. But if you do that now, black can sack his rook to 3b, because now, look at this, it's a threat mate. So he has to take it back, and then black recaptures. So maybe black's better. Rook drop an 8i is not powerful enough. The king's going to get away. So instead, before he sacks his bishop, he drops a pawn now. So now black has to move the rook to here, and then he does that. So that rook sacrifice on 3b disappears now. So he has to take the rook now. But before recapturing that, the horse goes ahead to 9i. And this is also good for white. So moving the king to 4h is not an option for black. So maybe the most reasonable way to stop the bishop sacrifice is to push up this pawn to 6f. But this time now, white can move his gold to 3c. You see only square left of the rook is, yes, 3f. So pawn drop, and the rook cannot go to 2f. So after the gold to 3c, black has to take out the bishop, but white recaptured by the rook. So black loses the rook, and he still has to take care of this pawn drop. So actual black is in a big trouble. So at this position, the best move for black is to just drop his bishop to 5f, putting a string to the rook. Also attacking at the rook at the same time, but the rook can simply come over to 5d. And you see black still has to do something about that pawn drop in 2h. But gold to 3i is a pretty awkward move in this position. It's not a good structure. So maybe pawn push to 1f, making an escaping route for the knight. Well, it's still a difficult game, but well, this is definitely not what black wants to do. So now we're going to see the standard move. And we have to go back to here. So instead of moving the silver to 7g, the standard move here, the main line is pawn drop. So the rook still goes back to 7d, and it's still making that bishop sacrifice threat. But this time it's just a pawn. So actually, black is not going to do this kind of bishop drop or anything. And actually, he can now simply move his rook back to 2d. So black doesn't care about that bishop sacrifice. Well, then white has to do that anyway, so he goes ahead, taking a pawn, and then he takes out this rook, but it's just a pawn. And moreover, here you can see this bishop skewer, right? So it's not so bad for black. Now white will drop a pawn to 2c, and this is a very important position for black. And if you're playing black, you might want to go pawn drop to 2e. Well, that's very tempting. But actually, it's not so good, because now white can just push this pawn up to 1d, attacking the bishop. So after all, it will just end up as a rook and bishop trade. And after this position, you might want to go ahead and take this pawn, letting the gold move far away from the king, thus making it a floating piece. But if you exchange the pawns here, now once again white can now drop a pawn here, and you have to do something about that. So it's not very good. There's this bishop fork actually, but it will be met by another bishop drop, and white is fine. So the thing is, you shouldn't take this pawn on 2c, and instead better moves are like bishop drop to 8c, or more interestingly, this is the best move here, pawn drop to 7d. I see if he takes it, bishop skewer, no, bishop fork, right? But if you want to do that, you shouldn't drop the pawn to 2e at this position to begin with. So let's not do that. And in this position, you should drop the bishop to here on 8c, for instance, and black might be better. And also, pawn drop to 7d is a primary line here. You see the rook cannot take it, it's pinned. You know, black can take the rook anytime. Again, he can't take it. So, for instance, if he tries to defend that square with the silver, well, it's not going to work. Black can just go ahead and another pawn drop. Silver has to run. Silver can't take it, so he runs in order not to get that bishop 5e fork. Well, then black should make that pawn drop now, because after the rook bishop trade, black can now drop a rook to here. Maybe a bishop drop, but it's obviously good for black. And also, because of that pawn drop on 2e, black can still make this bishop fork and let him drop another one, and then rook drop. So there's no bishop drop on 7b anymore. So this position is good for black. And after the pawn drop to 7d, maybe white will move the knight over to 3c, blocking the bishop's diagonal, thus trying to save his rook in the next move. And this knight blocks that bishop's diagonal from 5e2. But this time, black can simply take the rook. And a very good move here is bishop drop to 4f. A really nice square aiming at this diagonal. So this position is said to be good for black. So that's all for pawn 3a strategy. After all, this opening ends up in good positions for black. Okay? So hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.